So, this is part 17 now, a most peculiar timeline. I began to look at the events of the various things we've been talking about here and put it again into sort of a linear format. We see that God creates the world in 6 literal days, describing essentially a snow globe-styled enclosed world cosmology. Shortly after, Adam and Eve are placed in the Garden of Eden, and a serpent deceives them into disobeying Yahuwah, and a seed war begins. Cain kills his brother Abel. Seth replaces Abel, and the messianic seed is to come from his line, Seth. Plan B, corrupt the seed line. The Genesis 6 experiment occurs. Over a 1,200-year time period, all flesh becomes corrupted through various forms of Nephilim hybridization. Yahuwah destroys the whole world with a flood, preserving only those who made it onto Noah's ark. The whole earth is then repopulated by Noah's 3 sons. Nimrod is born in 1908 a.m., or a year since creation. Abram is born in 1948 a.m., and the seed war continues with 2 human players on the cosmic chessboard, Nimrod versus Abraham. Nimrod builds a tower in order to reach into heaven and ultimately attempts to kill Yahuwah. His plan fails when Yahuwah confounds the languages. People disperse, all talking about the same guy, Nimrod, only now with different names. Hence, he becomes the rebellious god of this world. Abraham produces Isaac, who produces Jacob, who is the father of the 12 tribes of Israel. The stage is now set for the entire biblical narrative, which ultimately leads to Messiah and his final victory in the cosmic seed war. Now, I'm going to shift gears and bring us to the present, keeping in mind that Nimrod was born in 1908 a.m. Of taking the genealogies and timelines that we are given in Scripture and putting it out graphically. And as I was doing that, I came to the conclusion, based on the timelines, that that was the year that Nimrod was born. Well, flash forward to our day, 1908 A.D., and you have Ernest Shackleton boarding a ship called the Nimrod. And he heads down to Antarctica on the Nimrod expedition. Now, and I found that quite by accident, okay? I was actually, if you're going to get into enclosed world cosmology, Antarctica becomes a big issue. You got to start figuring out what's going on with Antarctica, right? So I'm spending a lot of time, looking up things in Antarctica, spending time on Google Earth looking at Antarctica. And on Google Earth, they have these little icons where you can click on, you can see pictures that people have taken photographs and stuff like that, in some of these locations. So I was just kind of randomly scanning Antarctica on Google Earth, and I come across this caption pops up, the Nimrod Hut. I'm like, the Nimrod Hut? What is this? So I click on it, and it was like one of those 3D panoramas. So when it pops up, you can kind of literally look up, down, all around, in your computer and see this location. I'm like, what? The Nimrod Hut? What is this? So then that prompted me to look, and I discovered, the Nimrod expedition on the Nimrod ship that just so happened to be launched in 1908 A.D., coincidentally, on the Nimrod, who was born in 1908 A.M. And so, in that model, in the circular enclosed world model, Antarctica becomes the outer rim. But as I talked about last night, if there is a firmament and it is attached to a circular Earth, then presumably the firmament is somewhere between 800 and 1,200 miles inland from the coast, at least as best as I can tell. So, flash forward, Nimrod expedition. Many more Antarctic expeditions soon follow. In 1931, Auguste Piccard, from whom Captain Picard, any Star Trek fans out there, Captain Picard, was actually named after this guy who was a real scientist, shoots himself up into the stratosphere, getting to nearly 52,000 feet in a metal ball hanging from a balloon. And he's the first person to get that high. And he comes back, and for Popular Science magazine, he says he described the Earth as a flat disk with upturned edges. A few years later, the Russians got about 10,000 feet higher, and it's in the same magazine, Popular Science, covered that as well, and it said they tried in vain to detect any curvature at over 60,000 feet. This is in Popular Science magazine. Interesting. During World War II, the Nazis become obsessed with the occult and Antarctica. After World War II, the nations, especially Germany, Russia, and the United States, become quite obsessed with Antarctica. Enter Admiral Byrd. He's an interesting character who allegedly flew to the North Pole region in the late 1940s, and he came back claiming to have found an entrance to Inner Earth, Agartha. Here's a highly respected, highly decorated person in the U.S. military, in the Navy, coming back with tales of flying his plane up in the north, going into a hole, and apparently encountering an underground civilization of some sort. Next thing you know, they're sending him down to Antarctica. Well, before that, or in the same time period in the 1940s, we have The Babylon Working, taking place in 1946, along with L. Ron Hubbard, the founder of Scientology, JPL founder Jack Parsons, who was a disciple of Aleister Crowley, engaging in ritualistic sex magic in order to incarnate the so-called Moonchild with the Scarlet Woman named Babylon.
During the 1930s and 1940s, the OTO Lodge in California was headed by a brilliant young rocket designer called Jack Parsons. Jack Parsons developed patented rocket technology, which is still in use by NASA to this day. NASA named a crater on the dark side of the moon in honor of Jack Parsons. Jack Parsons worked during the day to develop rocket propulsion systems which would serve NASA's space program, which was controlled by ex-Nazi SS officers such as Wernher von Braun, who had been brought to the USA by the CIA's Project Paperclip. At night, Jack Parsons would hold sex magic rituals in his house in Pasadena and initiate fellow scientists at the Los Alamos Atomic Bomb Laboratory. Jack Parsons was fully aware of what his rocket designs would eventually be used for. Not far from Jack Parsons' rocket lab in Pasadena, Robert Oppenheimer was building the world's first atom bomb, which would be exploded at Los Alamos near a place called the Road of Death, which lies on the 33rd degree parallel. Once installed as the head of the OTO's American operation, Jack Parsons conducted a giant satanic ritual, aided by a fellow OTO member with the codename Freighter H. In 1948, the same year that George Bush Sr. was baptized as Magog, Jack Parsons undertook one of the most dark rituals known to Kabbalists, the Babylon Working. This ritual requires the initiate to visualize the Kabbalistic Tree of Life, with its 10 spheres and 22 connecting pathways. Between the top 3 spheres and the lower 7 spheres, there is the so-called abyss, the place where one's personality, possibly even one's sanity, is potentially destroyed. If the initiate successfully spans the abyss with personality intact, then he becomes a black brother of the Kabbalah, a black magician of the so-called left-hand path. In the tradition of Judaic mysticism, these black magicians are utter evil and are in themselves pestilence. This giant Babylon working ritual saw Parsons, aided by his magical protege, Freighter H, project their astral bodies into the dark abyss of Lucifer. 1948 saw George Bush Sr. baptized in the name of Magog, the spirit who would lead the army of demons against Christ at the apocalypse of Armageddon. That same year, Jack Parsons baptized himself as Belerion Armilas al-Dajjal, the Antichrist. Parsons took on the ancient Judaic teaching that Christ and his church were the enemy of civilization, and that they had to be destroyed. On a 40-day pilgrimage in the Mojave Desert, the place where Area 51 now resides, Parsons summoned forth Babylon, the Scarlet Woman, the whore of the apocalypse, the consort of the great beast Satan 666. According to the mysterious Freighter H, during the ritual he saw Parsons rip a hole in space-time, and something evil flew in. So who was the mysterious Freighter H? None other than the author and inventor of the new cult religion of Scientology, Mr. L. Ron Hubbard. Former initiate of Aleister Crowley's OTO, Hubbard wrote a so-called sacred text called Dianetics, which now has an inspired following of evangelical millionaires in Hollywood, just as the Kabbalah training schools are now brim full of people who had their interest in these Judaic magical techniques inspired by Britney Spears and Madonna. Jack Parsons had a sex magic partner in the OTO named Marjorie Cameron. Whilst staying with her friend Renata Drux in Hollywood, Marjorie Cameron confessed that she had been part of the Babylon working ritual. She said that it had been devised by Jack Parsons, L. Ron Hubbard, Aleister Crowley, and Manhattan Project scientists based at the Los Alamos Atomic Bomb Research Unit, headed by Jewish scientist Robert Oppenheimer. Marjorie Cameron confessed that during the Babylon working ritual, assisted by L. Ron Hubbard, Jack Parsons had sexually impregnated her at the point when the spirit of the Antichrist was bestowed upon him. Cameron Parsons had been made pregnant with the child of the Antichrist.
Byrd goes to Antarctica leading a whole bunch of ships down there on an expedition called the Operation High Jump in 1947. Why did they call it High Jump? Well, when you get to Antarctica, that's what you got to jump over. You got to get up over that wall. So, in 1947, we also have the founding of the International Monetary Fund, the start of the Jewish immigration to Israel, a young Bedouin shepherd discovers the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the alleged UFO crash happens in Roswell, New Mexico. Things are starting to happen that make me go, what's happening here? A nation called Israel is established in 1948. MK Ultra begins early in the 1950s, officially runs from 1953 to 1973. Operation Deep Freeze, 1955 to 1956. More nations go down there. Prior to Deep Freeze, Admiral Byrd got on national television and talked about, man, all these natural resources are down there. There's another country the size of the United States over there, on the other side. And people are like, what? All kinds of people are getting interested in going down to Antarctica. But then something changes as a result of that mission. Sputnik is launched in 1957. Both NASA and DARPA, how many of you guys know what DARPA is? Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, doing all the top secret, Batman type technology stuff. DARPA and NASA are both created in 1958. Excuse me. The Antarctic Treaty is drawn up and goes into effect in 1961. Now, many people who want to scoff at, I'm going to just call it biblical cosmology, say, why don't you just get a boat, go down to Antarctica, and go find the firmament, Rob? Well, first of all, I've worked in cold weather. I'm not going to do that again. I like my fingers and toes. I want to keep them. Second of all, you can't just do that. When you look into the regulations of the Antarctic Treaty, and that's why I had made a statement that anybody who signed the Antarctic Treaty, all those nations would be quote-unquote in on it if there is in fact a conspiracy. Anybody, and there's many nations who did sign it. You can't just go down there. Yeah, you could go there. You could charter a boat, whatever, go down there. But you can only go where they allow you to go. And the requirements that you have to go through, the paperwork and everything, if you can even get that far, and it's very expensive, good luck. If you can even get that far, you will only be allowed to go where they let you go. You can't just go wander off, and those who have tried, they either ended up dead or, arrested or taken away or what have you, disappeared. So look into the Antarctic Treaty if you want to know more on that. Some knucklehead out there has put together a $100,000 flat Earth challenge for Rob Skiba. Okay. This is just, first of all, I don't believe that these people have that kind of money. Second of all, it would cost more than that to go down there and do everything that needs to be done. Third of all, I have no interest in going to one of the most hostile places on the earth, and it's extremely dangerous, and I have no interest in going down there. I've already been convinced. I don't need to go do something as stupid as that for some idiot that's trying to offer me $20,000 a year for 5 years that he doesn't even have. Yeah, I got to show you something else. Just for those people who, are upset with me calling this guy an idiot. Let's see. As Forrest Gump said, stupid is as stupid does. This is just one of many reasons why. Listen to this genius.
Got to go out there and look back. And you'd have to be 200 to 300 miles out to be able to look back and take a decent picture and get the whole thing or close to the whole thing in one shot. That's really difficult. That's hard to do. But to prove that the Earth is flat, all you have to do is go to Japan on the flat Earth model. Go to that Japan. Of course, the problem is, I don't know how you're going to get to that Japan because Japan isn't there. That's not where Japan is. To get to Japan, you'd have to go to LA, jump on a flight, and fly west, not east, but west. So that's, you got a problem right there. How do you get to the Japan on the flat Earth model? So, but let's lay that aside. Let's say you could get to the Japan on the flat Earth model. Let's say you could do that. All you have to do is find a high place or a low place because the Earth is flat. Remember, it's flat. The whole thing's flat. So all you have to do is just go to the flat Earth Japan and just look out over the flat. Because water finds its level, right? Water doesn't curve, right? So it's flat, right? Okay, so all you have to do is go to the flat Earth model Japan and just look out over the ocean, and you should see it. You should see a rim of ice circling around that part of the Earth if it's flat. And it would also be easy to charter a boat or a ship and just go out there. Easy, so much easier to prove the Earth is flat than it is to prove the Earth is a globe. If your criteria is, well, we want one shot.
Need I say more? Wow. Alrighty then. But to answer the challenge, why I wouldn't go down there, I'm going to conclude this video with a mirror of Taboo Conspiracies video. Antarctica, sorry, we're closed. Our hidden flat Earth. But for all you guys that are, oh, yeah, okay, just show us a picture.
Just go to Antarctica, take a picture, go touch the dome, and show the rest of us, all right?
This is why that can't be done. Please try to pay attention. Thank you.
Welcome, everyone. This video is in response to the many globe propagandists who demand that I show a picture of the edge of the flat Earth. For the dozens of these ball-loving zealots with multiple sock puppet accounts who repeat this mantra daily, your demand is ridiculous. But you probably already knew that, right? And that's why you probably keep demanding it. It's actually pretty funny that I just got one of these take a picture comments an hour ago. I'm going to prove in this video that independent travel is not allowed under the Antarctic Treaty System. That fact alone should cause any thinking person to begin questioning our official models. Because something big is being hidden from we, the plebeians, and we're not talking about penguins. For most flat earthers, based on the information that we can reasonably gather, Antarctica constitutes the outer rim of the known world. In other words, Antarctica is likely the shoreline to all of the world's oceans. Like a ring magnet, north constitutes the center of our flat Earth map, and south is every direction away from the northern center. And before I get a dozen comments claiming that such a magnet is impossible, here's a ring magnet shown here. Notice that south is in every direction away from the center north magnetic pole. This is where the 60th south parallel is on a Mercator map. This is the 60th south parallel on a potential flat Earth azimuthal equidistant map. It seems that Antarctica constitutes the circular shore of the known world. So, demanding that I take a picture of a possible edge of the Earth, if any, requires me to not only travel below the 60th south parallel, represented by this circle, but also to cross the entire breadth of Antarctica. According to official numbers, Antarctica has a diameter of roughly 3,400 miles. And so that means our trek will include a long boat ride for hundreds of miles below the 60th south parallel, plus a minimum 6,800-mile round-trip hike across Antarctica. That's assuming the official model is correct. Maybe we could fly to one of the ceremonial pole areas, but that would still leave at least a 3,400-mile hike. In addition, we wouldn't know for sure whether the plane trip itself was interfering with our results, since the pilot would have to follow a designated path outlined by the Antarctic Treaty System, and who truly knows what direction that is until we get there. In order to be fully confident, we would really need to stick to the ground and have control over our own pathway, where we can control our direct southerly route opposite of the northern magnetic pole. Now, whether Antarctica is a smaller continent next to the outer rim, or whether Antarctica is indeed the shoreline of the known world, I don't know the answer. Flat earthers don't have a government budget to spend $1 billion to hire hundreds of cartographers and fleets of boats and planes to map the entire world. But even if flat earthers had the money, we would still run into the Antarctic problem, which is the point of this video. So, what is the Antarctic problem? It is the fact that independent travel is not allowed below the 60th south parallel in any reasonable manner to make any determination as to whether Antarctica is the shoreline boundary circumscribing the known world, or whether Antarctica is simply a continent a little north of the true but unnamed southerly shoreline of the Earth's oceans. For all we know, Antarctica may be an infinite plain that is uninhabitable at further distances. Again, we don't know. But, as I will describe in this video, I suspect that Antarctica is the shoreline circumscribing the known world due to the unbelievable restrictions placed on travel there. Excluding a couple of questionable claims, the total lack of north-south circumnavigation only proves the same. But if I'm not allowed by our governments to independently travel below the 60th south parallel and then to traverse Antarctica over 6,800 miles, then I cannot take a picture of a theoretical edge, dome, or those other lands beyond the South Pole, whatever the case may be. But you probably don't quite grasp how much area is really being blocked off under the Antarctic Treaty System. Let's look at it from the alleged 60th north parallel, because this will give you an idea of the tremendous area blocked off to independent exploration. This is the area of the 60th north parallels. As you can see, the 60th north parallel includes all of northern Canada, Alaska, much of Russia, including St. Petersburg and other major cities, Finland, Sweden, Norway, Iceland, Greenland. It is huge. Now, why in the world is this much area blocked off at the south? Do you really think it's because of penguins?
You see, first there was just one, now there's thousands of them.
Are they trying to tell us something?
So what's the problem?
Well, among other things, we are messing with their food chain.
And we have got to do something about it.
We suggest a ban on all marine harvesting.
Do you think the child propaganda from Happy Feet is true? The Antarctic Treaty was executed in 1959 and has been in place ever since. Think about it. No country had any real alleged concerns about the environment at that time. One of the more interesting facts is that the Soviet Union also ratified the treaty, and did so from the beginning on December 1st, 1959. Do you really think the Soviets were truly concerned about the penguins and the fragile Antarctic environment? In other words, America, the USSR, and the rest of the major countries of the world remained partners in generally closing Antarctica throughout most of the so-called fake space race, the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, the fake moon landings, most of the Cold War, the Vietnam War, the Six-Day War, the Soviet-Afghan War, and the collapse of the Soviet Union, which at that time Russia continued as a signatory in 1992. That's some peculiar cooperation transcending international conflicts, don't you think? Do you really think that the vast resources and strategic military benefits of Antarctica were multilaterally put aside because of penguins? Even North Korea has been a signatory since 1987. For some strange reason, the Antarctic Treaty has remained sacrosanct for nearly 60 years, regardless of worldwide conflicts. For the reasonable, objective person, alarm bells should be going off right now. As I was preparing this video, I found something else that's interesting. Out of all the flags of all the countries across the Earth, can you guess which one only shows a map of the country as the emblem of the country? You guessed it. Only one. Antarctica. Yeah, the one country they want you to know the shape of. That doesn't reek of programming, does it? Let me make this clear from the beginning. Travel to Antarctica is more difficult than travel to a military base. Sure, the military base may have a visitor shop near the entrance, but if you go beyond that visitor shop or another designated travel area without clearance, you're going to get arrested, or something worse. I'm sure I already have a few globe shields ready to pounce, armed with various inanities to counter my statement, but let's ignore the global spin. This video is about evidence and facts and the reasonable assumptions based thereon. So let's decide to take a theoretical trip across Antarctica to find the edge, if any. I'm not talking about going to the visitor center along the edge of Antarctica, or an overly expensive cruise to a small ice shelf along the edge with a small excursion, or a flight to one of the multiple ceremonial poles, and then straight back again. Yeah, that's not strange at all. I must reiterate, because I will get a dozen comments telling me to take a cruise or that someone's best friend went to Antarctica. I am not talking about a trip to one of the few designated tourist locations of Antarctica. I'm talking about a real trek, pointed directly south across the entire 3,400-mile breadth of Antarctica and back again to determine whether Antarctica circumscribes the known world and to possibly determine whether there's an edge, a dome, or whatever, and then take a picture of it. I'm talking about repeating the trek of Admiral Byrd and discovering that area as big as the United States that has never been seen by a human being on the other side of the South Pole, full of minerals and such just waiting to be explored.
But strangely enough, there's left in the world today an area as big as the United States that's never been seen by a human being. And that's beyond the pole on the other side of the South Pole from Middle America. And I think it's quite astonishing that there should be an area as big as that unexplored.
Okay, let's get started with our theoretical trip. So what is required to trek across the entire breadth of Antarctica? Now, I'm in the United States, and so we're going to examine it from the position of a slave of the U.S. But the rules are going to be the same for all 53 signatory countries of the Antarctic Treaty, and everyone else, since these countries all enforce the same provisions. To begin with, we need to understand that anything below the 60th south parallel is referred to as the Antarctic Treaty Area. What does that mean? That means I'm generally not allowed within hundreds of miles of Antarctica, from approximately 400 to 900 miles, without obtaining a permit to do so. Now, the U.S. government has recorded that some sailors have seen the mountain ranges of Antarctica at 300 miles distance while sailing. Of course, 300 miles should be impossible on the globe with a curvature drop of 11.4 miles, but the 60th parallel is between 400 and 900 miles away from the shoreline of Antarctica. Even under a flat Earth, that's a lot of lower atmosphere to see through, also referred to as atmospheric extinction factor, and a lot of angular size reduction. Despite the claims of the ignorant globe zealots, you can't see through that much lower atmosphere. In other words, I can't even see Antarctica from the ocean without first obtaining a permit from the U.S. State Department, or whatever department that controls that in your country. Taking a trip to the 60th South Parallel isn't going to accomplish anything, and so we're stuck with getting a government permit. So let's go through the steps to obtaining a permit from the U.S. State Department. This is the handbook of the Antarctic Treaty System. These are the rules that govern all signatories to the treaty. We'll be citing to it regularly as it lays down the rules that govern the Antarctic Treaty beyond the fluff of the treaty language itself. Most importantly, we're going to look at the rules governing non-governmental activities located here, and some of the rules regarding the protection of the environment located here. Now, as a U.S. slave, this is the first form you'll have to submit to get approved to travel to Antarctica. The form itself seems rather innocuous until you understand exactly what is involved in the application process. In summary, Antarctica is treated as a giant natural reserve. Like a military base, all activities and pathways in Antarctica must be approved. This is unlike any other area in the world, except maybe a place like North Korea. So, when I say that no independent travel is allowed below the 60th south parallel, I'm stating an admitted fact well recorded as international law. The protocol states, as a matter of principle, that all activities are to be planned and conducted on the basis of information sufficient to evaluate their possible impact on the Antarctic environment and its associated ecosystems, and on the value of Antarctica for the conduct of scientific research. Organizers should be aware that the environmental protocol requires that activities shall be modified, suspended, or canceled if they result or threaten to result in impacts upon the Antarctic environment or dependent or associated ecosystems. If you visit Russia, with a Russian visa, for example, are you limited to one particular neighborhood and certain pathways? For those who visit America as a tourist, are you restricted to New York City? Or are you generally allowed to travel around America? No one is just allowed to travel around Antarctica. All of your activities, vehicles, and pathways must be approved, but it gets much worse. Now, how many genuine people watching this video think that the purpose of seeing the edge, the dome, or the extended plain beyond Antarctica would be approved by the U.S. State Department and the other myriad of agencies? Are you ready to litigate the matter when some State Department official arbitrarily says something like, "I think your expedition is frivolous and would be too damaging to the environment, especially in the light of the frivolity of the expedition"? I don't think a court will overturn that decision, especially when treaty law supersedes any rights you may think you have. So, we're going to have to come up with some fake expedition that will somehow get approved. Let's say we're a tree-hugging Luciferian geologist conducting a comprehensive analysis of the global carbon footprint on Antarctica and its flora and fauna. I think that sounds plausible, and so we could hypothetically fake our way in with respect to our purpose, but it will be tricky. Okay, I'm not advocating that anyone break the law. This is all theoretical. That brings us to the next point. Entire swaths of land are entirely off limits to all travel. These are called specially protected areas. It's pretty much guaranteed that no one is going to get a permit to go through a specially protected area. If my math is right, that's 1,373 square miles that are allegedly specially protected areas. You can see the maps on the websites, but I don't have time to plot all of them. Now, I agree that's not huge in comparison to the total alleged area of Antarctica. But I believe there's a distinct possibility that those swaths of land could be coordinated in such a way as to prevent me from going through Antarctica easily. So, right from the beginning, my route may be extra hard, especially if mountain pathways are blocked and the areas are much larger than claimed due to likely globe distance shenanigans. But let's go ahead and assume we can navigate around those prohibited, specially protected areas. Next, no motorized equipment is allowed at all for non-governmental personnel. Page 308 states, "Do not use aircraft, vessels, small boats, or other means of transport in ways that disturb wildlife either at sea or on land." That seems kind of hard and very subjective, doesn't it? Antarctica itself is supposed to have a diameter of 3,400 miles. That means no motorized equipment for at least a 6,800-mile round trip? That sounds pretty damn impossible, right? Especially if Antarctica is much bigger than what is claimed. What about sled dogs? Surely they'll be allowed. What's that? Sled dogs aren't even allowed? Okay, so our trip is now limited to a very long hike in insanely harsh conditions over an extreme rise of elevation. On a side note, Antarctica has the highest average elevation of any alleged continent, but I'm sure that's just coincidence, right? But getting back to our insane trip, we not only have to walk at least 6,800 miles, mostly depending on when we need to turn around, we must also tread extremely lightly as walking on plants in Antarctica is prohibited. I can't damage plants or frighten wildlife on a 6,800-mile journey in a wilderness? I wonder if the Lewis and Clark expedition was limited by such requirements. Good luck traversing 6,800 miles on foot without damaging plants or frightening wildlife with no motorized equipment. I'm not saying that we couldn't figure out a way to get around these big issues, or maybe we could just, theoretically ignore the issues once we get there. But again, I'm not advocating that anyone break the law. I'm saying that these are listed enforcement rules under the Antarctic Treaty System. And so think of how easy it would be for one of the many international bureaucrats reviewing our application to deny a permit to trek across Antarctica based on this one plausible excuse. Sorry, you're going to end up walking on plants and scaring birds at least one time during your 6,800-mile journey, and the Antarctic Treaty System prohibits such activities. Application denied. For argument's sake, let's just assume we're going to figure out a way to get around that. Don't ask me how. The next issue is, how are we going to carry all that food and fuel for heat? And don't think that the Antarctic Treaty System isn't concerned with how we store our fuel. The United States itself is roughly 2,500 miles across. So imagine the difficulty of hauling food, climbing at extremely high and unknown elevations, and carrying all of your extremely warm gear and supplies across the United States from coast to coast and back again, all on foot with no food stops along the way. And don't forget, we're going to have to haul our poop as well. You are going to have to drag your poop with you on your 6,800-mile Antarctic hike. But it gets worse. Your poop is regulated by a different pseudo-government agency, the National Science Foundation. Here's where you can learn about what permit is required if you wanted to dispose of your poop on your 6,800-mile journey if you don't want to carry it. Could you imagine for your next trip to France and the custom agent saying, "Welcome to France. By the way, no vehicles are allowed, no animals are allowed, do not walk on any plants, and here's a bag for your poop. Be sure to bring it back full." If you don't want to carry your poop, you're going to have to get a permit from the National Science Foundation. Enjoy your stay. But here's another and potentially bigger problem. What if there is no edge when you get there, but the conditions only get worse? How many years of supplies can one carry by a handheld sled and some skis? What if Antarctica goes beyond 3,400 miles? What then? When do you turn your back, and how do you prove it? Because the globe shows are just going to call you a liar anyways. Any sane person right now would have to admit that our little trip is impossible, but we have a lot of paid-for apologists for our slave masters who will still somehow claim that I'm lying when I say that independent travel in Antarctica is prohibited. But we're not done. Going back to our form DS-4131, in addition to disclosure to other parties to the treaty, the information provided may be shared with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency to ensure compliance with 40 CFR Part 8 Environmental Impact Assessment of Non-Governmental Activities in Antarctica, as well as with other relevant U.S. agencies. This brings us to one of the most important issues facing us. What is an environmental impact assessment? No country, even North Korea, would ever require an environmental assessment before traveling across their country. It's insane. Here's the definition of an environmental impacts assessment in the U.S. Code of Federal Regulations. Environmental impact assessment means the environmental review process required by the provisions of this part and by Annex 1 of the Protocol, and includes preparation by the operator and U.S. government review of an environmental document and public access to and circulation of environmental documents to other parties and the Committee on Environmental Protection as required by Annex 1 of the Protocol. Well, let's see what the Committee for Environmental Protection says. Article 8 of the Protocol requires the parties to conduct environmental impact assessments for the Antarctic activities and provides 3 levels of assessment according to the potential impacts of each activity. The procedures for environmental impact assessment are detailed in Annex 1 of the Protocol. If a proposed activity is determined in a preliminary stage of assessment to have less than a minor or transitory impact, it may proceed. If an activity is determined as likely to have a minor or transitory impact, then an initial environmental evaluation must be prepared. If an initial environmental evaluation indicates the potential for more than a minor or transitory impact, or if such impact is otherwise determined to be likely, a comprehensive environmental evaluation must be prepared. Draft CEEs are made publicly available and considered by the CEP, which then advises the ATCM, and that's a Antarctic Treaty Consultative Meeting, Comments provided by other parties in the ATCM must be addressed in a final CEE, which is used as a basis for making decision about whether and how the activity is conducted. Same law as here. It is the comprehensive environmental evaluation that's going to kill our expedition. Here's the regulation, and this applies to all signatories, including North Korea. Any operator who plans a non-governmental expedition that would require a CEE must submit a draft of the CEE by December 1st of the preceding year. Within 15 days of receipt of the draft CEE, EPA will send it to the Department of State, which will circulate it to all parties to the protocol, and forward it to the Committee for Environmental Protection established by the protocol, and publish notice of receipt of the CEE and request for comments on the CEE in the Federal Register, and will provide copies to any person upon request. The EPA will accept public comments on the CEE for a period of 90 days following notice in the Federal Register. The EPA, in consultation with other interested federal agencies, will evaluate the CEE to determine if the CEE meets the requirements under Article 8, Annex 1 to the protocol and the provisions of this part, and will transmit its comments to the operator within 120 days following publication in the Federal Register of the notice of availability of the CEE. So, now, I'm sure most of you probably just went brain dead when I read that, so let me explain it. First, our CEE, that's our Comprehensive Environmental Evaluation, must pass the EPA's initial review. Not an easy task. Next, the Department of State, along with its Office of Ocean and Polar Affairs Bureau of Oceans, Environment, and Science, must review it. Next, it will be sent to all parties. That's 100 countries, by the way. Next, your assessment must be approved by an international bureaucracy called the Committee for Environmental Protection. After their highly unlikely approval, the EPA will then publish it in the United States Federal Register. Now, why would they do that? Because any supposed private tree-hugging group can now sue to stop you from going there. Once that is done, assuming you haven't been sued, then the EPA, along with all of the other interested federal agency, whatever the hell that means, evaluates it again. Do you realize the amount of legal work this would entail? Do you realize how easy it would be for any one of hundreds of entities or thousands of bureaucrats to halt your expedition? Again, this applies to all countries. One person in the comments of my last Antarctic video claimed that it wasn't necessary in the United Kingdom. Well, he lied. The Environmental or Madrid Protocol is part of the Antarctic Treaty System and applies to all countries. Here is the requirement on the UK application if you're interested. As explained above, for every person in the United States who wants to get a permit to travel across Antarctica has to first submit the environmental impact assessment to the EPA. You know, the freedom-loving EPA.
Beware! Beware! Time is short! EPA! 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 Believe me! Believe me! Thanks for listening.
Lost them, sir.
Damn it! Well, then you find them, and you get them back in the dome. And to make sure nobody else gets out, I want roving death squads around the perimeter 24/7.
Do you know what the environmental impact statement costs? This is very similar. A typical environmental impact statement costs from $250,000 to $2 million. And those are a lot easier than this comprehensive environmental analysis required under the Antarctic Treaty. For us, the biggest problem is that you would have to incur the expense of the environmental impact assessment before you know if you're denied, due to whatever arbitrary claim a bureaucrat can think of. Do you see how difficult this environmental assessment will be? How would one know the environmental impact on an area which you've never been to, and very little information would be available? With a normal environmental assessment, you'd be able to send an engineering firm to the location to make the assessment with attorneys who would draft the statement. In this case, you can't send an engineering firm all the way to Antarctica, and so you have to hire Antarctic experts who have been to the same places you're planning on walking through. Now, how many of those do you think there are? I say that we can safely assume that the price of getting an environmental impacts assessment approved by the EPA and the international agency would cost millions, assuming no supposed private group sues you once once it's published in the Federal Register. Do you have more than $2 million to spend for an environmental impact assessment? And then, what if the EPA or the Committee for Environmental Protection or one of the other agencies says no? Maybe that not enough information was provided. Are you ready to spend another $2 million to fight that in court? But you still have to have your purpose approved. Do you see the problem there? You would likely spend millions on getting the environmental impact statement, only later to have some official at the International Committee for Environmental Protection reject your purpose in Antarctica. You would truly gamble millions in this silly endeavor. To learn more about the environmental assessment procedures with the Committee for Environmental Protection, you can research it here. See also. Let's get to the final issue we're going to run into. 7 countries claim territorial rights to various parts of Antarctica. Argentina, Australia, Chile, France, New Zealand, Norway, and the United Kingdom all maintain territorial claims in Antarctica. I did find it interesting that the USSR never claimed territorial rights to Antarctica. Yeah. I'm willing to bet that my trip across Antarctica is going to need other permits from other countries based only on territorial claims. Getting more permits or visas from other countries who have alleged territory in Antarctica? Yeah, that shouldn't add too much to our already strained budget. Now, just for the propagandist who's going to claim that's not true, I quote, "The Antarctic Treaty puts aside the potential for conflict over sovereignty for providing that nothing that occurs while the treaty is enforced will enhance or diminish territorial claims." Meaning, the territorial claims trump. So, the next dumb shill who demands that you take a picture of the edge or that anyone can go to Antarctica and see for themselves that it's a continent, share this video because everything in here is fact that anyone can look up, and I'll try to have all the links in the description. Of course, the lying minions from the Ministry of Truth will spin and call you names, but at least the rest of the world will see the liars for who they truly are.
This one really caught my attention. Operation Dominic and Project Fishbowl commence. Before the space race, there was the missile race. And right after Operation Deep Freeze, one of the first things the United States and Russia immediately began to do is shoot high-altitude nuclear bombs into the sky. We called it Operation Fishbowl. Operation Fishbowl?
So let's just do a quick recap here. 1, everyone becomes obsessed with Antarctica in the late 40s and late 50s. 2, everyone leaves Antarctica to draft up a treaty which would prohibit anyone from going there except under the express strict guidelines of the treaty. 3, the United States creates NASA and DARPA, you know, that organization which creates black budget projects for the military and other agencies and other groups. 4, the United States and Russia start blowing up the sky. 5, the United States and Russia become obsessed with what's above us in space. 6, the United States and Russia become obsessed with what's beneath us.
Several decades ago, 2 countries, America and Russia, raced to drill the deepest hole into the Earth with the goal of discovering what was at its core. Both projects were massive undertakings, and the world was fixated on what mysteries they'd find beneath the surface. Russia's efforts resulted in something called the Kola Super Deep Borehole, and when you see it, you might have to pick your jaw off the floor. Both countries drilled boreholes deep into the ground until they couldn't go any further. They used enormous metal contraptions that were designed to break through even the toughest material. The world watched in awe as the Americans kicked off the race. The enormous drills were fired up, and everyone hoped the project would go according to plan. What kind of mysteries would the drillers find, if any? The United States called the endeavor Project Mohole, and they began their drilling off the Pacific coast of Mexico in 1961. This would be a massive effort with global interests, and there was a lot riding on the team's work. Unfortunately, soon after the project began, it was abandoned due to lack of funding.
Lack of funding because they decided to put all their funding into going to Antarctica looking for moon rocks and faking the whole world with the moon landings.
Almost a decade later, the Russians had organized their own drilling team and began their quest to reach the center of the Earth. On May 24th, 1970, they set their sights on the Kola Peninsula. The Russians called their endeavor the Kola Super Deep Borehole. The end goal of the drilling project was to reach a depth of 49,000 feet into the Earth's crust. The race to the center of the Earth was an exciting and intriguing time for the world. In the end, the goal was never reached, but at least the scientific community benefited from the efforts. Though defunct, this phenomenal structure still stands as a reminder of one project that had the world on the edge of its seat.
Okay, so they didn't get to 49,000. They only got to something like, I think he said 40,200 or something like that, which is less than 8 miles.
Even the deepest drilled hole is still some 3,955 miles short of the center of the Earth. Barely a pinprick on the surface of our planet.
So we have all these pictures in the textbook about the center of the Earth and what the core of the Earth and everything else looks like. And they're going to say, all right, it's all fiction about the inner Earth and hollow Earth, all that stuff, when they have never even gone deeper than 8 miles. It's unbelievable. We have been lied to with artwork, pictures, paintings, drawings, CGI. Everything about our Earth and everything about space, artwork. And oh, by the way, you know, okay, we're in a race, right? And we supposedly beat Russia in the space race, whatever that means. You know, we did something more than or faster or whatever. Who cares? They just gave up? Really? They just gave, I quit. I'm going home. No, they didn't give up. They sent dozens of missions to Antarctica while we were doing the Apollo program. Let that sink in. Okay. I got to say, it sure looks to me like they found something in Antarctica which challenged everything we thought we knew, and thus they immediately set out to find how high our enclosed world dome is and how deep the foundation goes. That's exactly what somebody would do if they discovered they were in a cage. They try to figure out how, wait a minute, what are the boundaries? How do I get out of here? That's exactly all of the activities that the United States and Russia in particular engaged in immediately after Operation Deep Freeze all points to exactly that. I don't know how you could come to any other conclusion. So then all of a sudden the United States and Russia engaged in these high altitude nuclear tests, and the United States calls theirs Operation Dominic, within which we have Operation Fishbowl. Now hold that thought. This is all happening. If you go and look on the Operation Dominic entry, you see the different dates. We're 1962. This is the early part of 1962. We're talking May. I mean, look at all these bombs going off. 25 April, 1962, 27 April, 2 May, 4 May, 6 May, 8 May, 9 May, 11 May, 11 May, 12 May, 14 May, 19, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This is all before President Kennedy's "Let's go out in the space" speech. But I think a lot of people don't realize that our first stop wasn't the moon. Even before we went to the moon, they were sending probes all of a sudden after all of this. Okay, keep the timeline in mind. Operation High Jump, Operation Deep Freeze, Bird dies, NASA's founded, Antarctic Treaty signed, Operation Dominic and Fishbowl take effect. And if you notice during President Kennedy's speech, he was talking about that they've already got probes headed to Venus. Wait a minute. We're already sending stuff to Venus and Mars? We haven't even been to the moon yet. And so I was looking into that, and on planetary.org/explore/space topics /space missions to Venus-Mercury.html. And you can go through this site. It starts sort of from the bottom up. As early as February 4th, 1961, they're sending a probe, Sputnik 7. Russia sent this probe to check out Venus. The final stage of the rocket carrying Sputnik 7 into orbit failed, and the spacecraft was unable to achieve the necessary trajectory to carry it onto Venus. Then Venera 1, Russia, sends out another probe February 12, 1961. They lost communications while it was on its way to Venus. Then NASA sends up Mariner 1, July 22nd, 1962. Now, that's right in the middle of Dominic and Fishbowl, that we sent out a probe to go check out Venus. It veered off course and was destroyed by ground controllers. So then Russia sends up another one, Sputnik 19, August 25th, 1962. The spacecraft made it into orbit, but the rocket's last stage failed, and Sputnik 19 was unable to achieve its Venus trajectory and re-entered the Earth's atmosphere 3 days later. NASA, August 27th, 1962. Sends its probe. It says Mariner 2 was the first spacecraft to successfully fly by Venus at an altitude of 34,773 kilometers. The spacecraft discovered ground temperatures, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so this is during the time period that between August 27th, 1962 and December 14th, 1962 that we had President Kennedy's speech on September 12th, 1962. So that's what he's referring to. You know, we've already got stuff out there and you can read about the other ones that were, you know, checking out Venus, I guess Mercury also, and attempted probes going to Mars. Now, this is all before we've even been to the moon. So it appears that whatever happened in Antarctica, everybody got kind of maybe nervous or excited or whatever and said, okay, what is the deal? You know, we've looked through telescopes. We've seen our so-called neighbors, Venus and Mars, through telescopes. Our assumption is the solar system is, you know, set up in the Copernican model. And, but yet maybe they found a dome and they started to question all that. So the first thing they do is send out probes to go, wait a minute. What in the world? If we're in a dome, how high does this thing go? So they start launching high altitude nuclear bombs. And if you look at the videos on Operation Fishbowl and Starfish Prime and all those high altitude tests, I mean, it looks like they're hitting something up there. I mean, at least from a conspiratorial tinfoil hat wearing perspective, that's what it looks like. Now, this is what blew my mind. You can read more on all that if you'd like. To get caught up to speed on what's going on there. So I go to Lubbock and I'm doing this conference out there at Jared Cressman's father's church, Pastor Dan Cressman. And we get to talking about this whole issue of the flat earth stuff. And he goes, do you know what the name Dominic means? And I said, no. He says, you know, you talk about Operation Fishbowl, but check this out. Look up the name Dominic from the late Latin name Dominicus, meaning of the Lord. Fishbowl was part of Operation Dominic. It looks like they are sending high altitude nuclear bombs to test the fishbowl of the Lord, i.e., the firmament. Yeah.
So if they're trying to avoid a conspiracy, they're not helping with the names. They go down to Antarctica, everybody pulls out, we got to sign a treaty, nobody else can go back except under the express guidelines of the treaty, blah, blah, blah. Well, let's start shooting nukes up into the sky, and we'll call it Operation Fishbowl of the Lord. Maybe nobody will notice. Huh. Kennedy has his "We choose to go to the moon" speech, right? 1962. Space race is announced. Star Trek debuts, 66, it goes to 1969. Apollo 11 supposedly lands on the moon in 1969. Apollo ends in 1972, coincidentally just before the MK Ultra program officially terminates. I have become of the opinion that if the Apollo program was indeed a fraud, as I believe personally that it was, the astronauts may actually believe they did it. If they were MK Ultra'd, and again, the MK Ultra program just coincidentally happened to run at the exact same time period as the Apollo program, that they very likely could have been MK Ultra and very well could believe that they did what they did. How many of you have seen the press conference of the Apollo 11 crew after, yeah, that, like, I'm pretty spaz, hyper crazy anyway, but like if I had gone to the moon, I'd still be floating. You could not be like, woo, I went to the moon, man. Forget Michael Jackson. Yeah, I'd be doing moonwalk all over the place. Yeah, I'd have been jacked out of my mind for a long time. You got these three guys, the first three human beings ever to, you know, two of them to stand up, supposedly on the moon, and they look like somebody just told them Santa Claus isn't real, somebody shot their dog, you know. They're adopted, you know, their parents aren't really their parents. They didn't look like people who just came back from the most experience ever. If you watch, just Google the press conference Apollo 11 and watch that, especially the first 5 minutes or so. But something happens. If you continue watching that, they go from and Neil Armstrong, the way he was talking in that, I mean, it almost like the angle was like this, so you couldn't see his left ear. It almost looks like he was being told what to say. because he would pause in weird places and kind of stare out into space and say, you know, his cadence, the way he spoke, was very off. But then when they put on the slide presentation, all three of these guys became very animated, and it was almost like, if you know the Manchurian Candidate, you guys familiar with that? It was almost like there was a trigger. Like to me, at first they looked like very patriotic, good men, maybe, who were told to lie for their country. That's what it looked like. But then something happens, the slide presentation starts, and they change completely. And to me, it looks like MK Ultra.
At this time, I'd like to introduce the Apollo 11 crew, astronauts Neil Armstrong, Michael Collins, Edwin Aldrin. Neil?
It was our pleasure to have participated in one great adventure. It's an adventure that took place not just in the month of July, but rather one that took place in the last decade. We all here and the people listening in today had the opportunity to share that adventure over its developing and unfolding in the past months and years. It's our privilege today to share with you some of the details of that final month of July that was certainly the highlight for the three of us of that decade. We're going to divert a little bit from the format of past press conferences and talk about the things that interested us most, in particular the things that occurred on and about the moon. We will use a number of films and slides which most of you have already seen, and with the intent of pointing out some of the things that we observed on the spot, which may not be obvious to those of you who are looking at them here from the surface of Earth. The flight, as you know, started promptly. And I think that was characteristic of all the events of the flight. The Saturn gave us one magnificent ride, both into Earth orbit and on a trajectory to the moon. Our memory of that actually differs little from the reports that you have all heard from those previous Saturn V flights, and the previous flights served us well in preparation for this flight in the boost as well as the subsequent phases. We would like to skip directly to the translunar coast phase and remind ourselves of the chain of events, that long chain of events that actually permitted a landing, starting with the undockings, the transposition and docking sequence.
This was our first look at the magnificent machinery which had been behind us up until this point, the booster. Of course, the first and second stages had long since separated, but this shows the LEM nestled inside the third stage, the S-4B, after the translunar inject burn. This maneuver was an interesting combination of manual and automated techniques in that we programmed the onboard computer to make the turnaround and then these final maneuvers were made completely manually. As I approached the LEM, I had an easy time because I had a docking target, which is not too clearly visible here, which allowed me to align the probe and the drogue, which is the dark spot you see on the upper right. During this time, I also checked out the proper vehicle response to my stick inputs, and here shortly you'll see the actual docking somewhat speeded up. There's the point of contact, and in just a second you'll see a second, right there, a second small indication of the retract cycle when the 12 docking latch is made.
We made 2 entries into the lunar module. This is our first view of the inside of this. The final activation was made on the day of powered descent. On the 2 previous days, when we entered, we removed the probe and drogue and found that we had a rather long tunnel between the 2 vehicles. On entering the lunar module, one had to do a slight flip maneuver or a half gainer to get into position for the lunar module, of course, is in a sense upside down relative to the command module.
Now this picture doesn't show it, but at this phase in the trajectory we were looking out directly at the planet Earth. In the final phases of descent, after a number of program alarms, we looked at the landing area and found a very large crater just in the very left top corner of the picture. The camera is located in the right window and looks to the right, and it just barely sees this boulder field we're passing over right now. We're at 400 feet and those boulders are about 10 feet across. This was the area which we decided we would not go into, extended the range downrange, and saw this crater, which we passed over, this 80-foot crater, in the final phases of descent and later took some pictures of. Now you can see the exhaust being, the exhaust dust being kicked up by the engine, and this was some concern in that it degraded our ability to determine not only our altitude and altitude rate in the final phases, but also, and probably more importantly, our translational velocities over the ground. It's quite important not to stub your toe during the final phases of touchdown.